What's up everybody, and thank you for joining me for another video. My name is Whack4863, but you can call me Whack. The footage that you're watching right now is pre-patch that came out today, and I want you to pay close attention to the damage numbers. I pulled some stills from this video, and I'll put those up a little bit later on so that you can compare the amount of damage that my Necromancer was doing prior to the patch to the amount of damage that my Necromancer is doing now that the new Season 1 patch has been launched to the game. And I can tell you, it's more than half the amount of damage that I've lost in my Necromancer build. Now, keep in mind, this Necromancer build is the culmination of hundreds of hours of searching for specific gear to put it together so that it does the absolute most damage it possibly can. And recently, I had been focusing on working together a build that had more survivability, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a nightmare dungeon that is only maybe 10 levels higher than me, and I'm getting one shot. So I was working on putting that build together, but after today's patch notes, I'm not sure that I'm going to continue playing Diablo 4. I don't know if I'm even going to look at what's coming in the season, and the reason being is that at this level, at the level that I'm at, with the time that I've spent putting into the game to be level 100 and have what I would consider to be almost perfect gear, hundreds and hundreds of hours invested into it, to see more than half of my damage just get wiped out because they look at the top of the player base, the people that are showing the absolute best possible outcome in their videos, and they say, well, this is not good, we can't have this. Honestly, I should not have issues slaying monsters that are 5 levels below me, and I should not be in a situation where I know for a fact I cannot go into a dungeon that has enemies 10 levels higher than me and think that I'm going to survive. The only reason some of those high-level dungeons were completed by players in the first place is because they were actually able to put the damage out that they needed to from a distance in order to not get killed. Now that this nerf has come into play, I'm sure we're going to see a lot of these high-level dungeons not be completed. This is something where people are not going to be able to go in to a nightmare dungeon at level 80, level 75, level 100, and put out the amount of damage that they need to in order to be able to complete them. Let alone the fact that with this patch, they nerfed survivability across almost every single class except for maybe Sorcerer. I haven't personally played Sorcerer, so I don't know if that ended up being a buff or a nerf after all the changes that they made to damage reductions, total armors, and those different items. Yes, they buffed some of the things that the Sorcerer has, but with those buffs also came nerfs. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Sorcerer is actually in about the same spot now that they were before. Additionally, Ironhold Dungeon is no longer worth running for a loot dungeon. You do not get the amount of elites in this dungeon that you did prior to the patch, so you can mark this one off of your list of dungeons that you want to go and run for loot. This one now is in the dungeon graveyard with so many others that don't have the amount of elites that you want to see to gain that loot. Now we're coming up to the boss fight. I want you to pay close attention to the amount of bone spears that I throw for this boss. It's going to be a single one, and the boss is done. Now let's jump over to after today's patch, and we're going to look at this exact same dungeon, and I'm working very hard in this video to pull off things where you can see the amounts of damage very clearly. So most of the time, the highest damage you're going to see is around the 2.5 million area. Now that's when I am using corpse tendrils and throwing the bone spear, where before, if I was to do this same thing, I would see right around 5 million damage. It was easily 5 million damage on a regular basis, and that wasn't something that happened on a rare basis. It was something that happened consistently, where here I'm really having a hard time pulling off the 2.5 million damage, even with the corpse tendrils and the slow and the vulnerable. 2.5, 2.8 million is around the area of the highest damage. So about a 50% decrease to your damage output all the way around. Now you have to couple that with less survivability. So all the survivability from this point on has been reduced. Your total armor's been reduced. Your total damage reduction has been reduced. So you're going to find yourself in dungeons that you didn't have any problems with before. You're going to find yourself having a lot of issues and just chugging through potions a lot more, because the damage that you're putting out isn't enough to run through the dungeon the way you did before, and the amount of armor and damage reduction that you have now is not enough to sustain taking the hits that you were taking before. Additionally, if you've been playing with friends, monsters actually received a buff from multiple people playing. So it's actually more discouraging now for you to play with friends than it was before, which I think is backwards thinking in the grand scheme of things. The monsters didn't need a buff in the first place. I feel like this whole patch is a bit backwards. It's not what I expected when they're talking about, oh, we've got a new season, we're bringing new power. Well, you can't nerf everything in the game to bring new power. This is a good example of developers not understanding their game, not seeing how players are going to put builds together, and then having to hit the brakes and back way up when they see what players are actually capable of doing. There's no reason that I should have been able to pull out 5 million damage on a bone spear if that wasn't intended in the first place. So I have to wonder how much the developers actually paid attention to the builds that they put together and the builds that they made capable in the game prior to launch, because I see big knee-jerk reactions like this being a product of poor testing from the game development team. And honestly, it just pisses me off because I've grown to love Diablo. This is actually my first Diablo, and I was really enjoying playing it, even past the point of level 100, grinding that perfect set of gear. And now that I've done that, and I've seen the capabilities prior to this patch, I don't want to play Diablo 4 after this patch. I've been on a couple of times. I ran Iron Hold 4 or 5 times to make sure that there wasn't something that I was doing that was nerfing the amount of damage that I put out. I wanted to give you guys a good solid look at how much damage was lost just for the Bone Spear Necromancer. And I've got to say, I am not impressed by this patch. I'm not impressed with the way that they decided to change the Necromancer. Honestly, if anything, the Necromancer needed a buff to their survivability in the Bone Spear area. The Bone Spear, sure, does tons of damage, but it's a scenario where you better hit whatever is going to hit you before it hits you. That was the trade-off. You get those really high damage numbers because if they hit you, they are going to kill you. So you have to kill them before they touch you. Now your damage is half as much, and you still are in the situation, or even more in the situation, where you have to kill them before they touch you because of the big nerfs to the total armor and the damage reduction. This is just a level 95. Like I said, these monsters are actually a lower level than me, but if I was to pop on a nightmare dungeon and start running that, not only is my damage going to be reduced against those enemies, but their damage to me is going to be increased. So even more so the fact that I'm going to be one shot, and I probably can't take on the level of dungeon that I was able to take on before. Again, all of this after spending hundreds of hours working to perfect my gear, perfect my Paragon board, and really it's all wiped out and thrown away with the stroke of a few keys from the dev team putting together these nerfs. Now we're getting to the final boss fight here, and I want to show you how many of my bone spears it takes to kill this guy. There's one, and then I'm going to have to throw a second one. And the first time that I came in here, it was actually even worse. I was only able to get him to half of his health. Remember, this is something that is 5 levels below me, and I have perfected my gear. So let's jump into a couple of these stills here. These stills are from the videos that you saw today. This one obviously is from prior patch. You can see we have 4 million, we have 3 million, we have 5 million, 3 million, 2 million, 3 million. Basically the 2 million is 3 million, but you can see the damage that I'm doing there is quite a lot. Now this is the way that the Bone Spear Necromancer was able to go up against those higher level dungeons, as well as going up against Uber Lilith. I did test against Uber Lilith earlier on today, and the build that I had that was working perfectly prior to today's patch is not working now in the same way in order to kill Uber Lilith. You are not going to be able to go in there and kill her in the same fashion as easily as you were prior to this patch. Now let's look at one of the stills from today. You can see in between all of the vulnerables, my damage ranges everywhere from 83,506 all the way up to 2.4 million. So the damage has been reduced significantly for the Bone Spear Necro, with 2.4 to 2.8 million, maybe just barely capping over that 3 million in certain points. That's about the cap of what I saw. Now, I didn't show it in today's video, but the cap on my damage before, the highest number that I ever saw with my Bone Spear Necro, was actually 12 million. Now I'm going to touch on some of the notes from today's patch. If you want to see all of it, it's linked in the description of this video. But if you're running a Bone Spear Necromancer or a Necromancer in general, these patch notes are for you. Additionally, in the background, you can see my attempt at a tier 78 dungeon and what kind of work goes into running this kind of dungeon with a build that puts out up to 12 million damage, or on a regular basis, 5 million damage. So let's look at these notes. Decompose slow increase from 30 to 50, so there's a little buff. Paranormal Sever has a little bit of a buff, making the casts for vulnerable reduced from 4 to 3. Enhanced Blood Surge Healing has an increased maximum life of 3% instead of 2.5. Enhanced Blood Lance damage reduction for piercing reduced from 15% to 10%, so there's the first nerf. Bone Prison initial essence gained increased from 15 to 25, so there's a little bit of a buff. Abhorrent Iron Maiden gets a bit of a buff from 5% to 7% max life. Golems move faster and are unhindered through enemies when their cooldown is activated. Supreme Blood Wave leaves behind blood orbs earlier in its path. Raised Skeletons, Corpse Explosion, Corpse Tendrils range for auto ranging with a mouse and keyboard is increased by 50%. Raised Skeletal Priest bonus damage increased from 20 to 30. Raised Skeletal Priest healing increased from 10 to 15. Moving on to the skill tree passives here, the Evulsion bonus damage to vulnerable enemies is reduced from 6, 12, and 18 to 5, 10, and 15. That's a 1, 2, and 3% reduction in damage from all of your buckets when you're using the Evulsion bonus. Transfusion minion healing increased from 15, 30, and 45 to 20, 40, and 60%. Drain Vitality Lucky Hit Chance increased from 25% to 30%. Amplified Damage increased from 3, 6, and 9 to 4, 8, and 12. Book of the Dead changes. We have Necromancer minions will now automatically resummon after respawning during a world boss fight. I'm not exactly sure what they're talking about there, but if there was a bug with that, that's supposedly fixed. Skeleton Warrior Defenders upgrade Thorns Inherited increased from 40% to 50%. Shadow Skeleton Mage upgrade attacks required for an additional Shadow Bolt reduced from 5 to 4. Bone Skeleton Mage upgrade Fortify amount increased from 11% to 20%. Iron Golem upgrade attacks required for Slam Attack reduced from 5 to 4. On the Paragon board, the Essence Glyph bonus now affects all damage instead of just core skills, so essentially that is a buff. But here's where the big nerfs start to come into play. The Splintering Aspect Bone Shard damage bonus was reduced from 50 to 100% to 30 to 60%, so you're getting at least a 40% reduction there if you had a perfect aspect. You can see some of the other nerfs or buffs there for other items or other Necromancer builds. I'm not going to cover those, but if you want to look through those real quick, you can pause the video. Couple of unique item changes here. The Bloodless Scream Essence gained increased from 2 to 5 to 7 to 10. That's a pretty good buff. The Deathless Visage damage was increased from 0.25 to 0.35 all the way up to 0.28 to 0.38. Man, I think I'm really going to be able to tell the difference in the damage based on those numbers. Honestly, I don't know why they even did it. It doesn't seem like it's going to equate to any damage increase with all the nerfs that we've already seen. Okay, so now we're into general nerfs. These affect all classes, doesn't matter what class you're running. Developer's note here is the core stat bonus on weapons has been overperforming, so we're pulling back on this bonus. Strength reduced. Dexterity reduced, intelligence reduced, willpower reduced. It's all been cut in half from 50% to 25%. This next little bit reads really weird, and I think this is actually a buff and not a nerf. So the developer's note says cooldown reduction affixes often felt mandatory due to their raw power. We imagine cooldown reduction will remain a highly desirable stat, but the penalty for not prioritizing it won't be as harsh. So the cooldown reduction appears to be reduced by 30%, which would actually be a buff in the grand scale of things. It goes on to say the imbuement skill cooldown reduction reduced by 30% and the trap skill cooldown reduction reduced by 30%. So I believe what you're going to see is that your cooldown reductions will be 30% shorter, and then additionally, if you're running the imbuement skill or the trap skill, I think you'll see a cooldown reduction for those up to 60%. So I think this is a buff and not a nerf. On to more heavy-handed nerfs, you can see critical strike damage inherent on swords reduced by 50%. On top of that, vulnerability damage inherent on crossbows, but it's also on swords, reduced by 65%. So even though it says that it's inherent on certain items, the vulnerable damage altogether was reduced by 65% if I'm reading this correctly. And the critical strike damage on swords reduced by 50%, that's huge. So if you add both of those buckets together, this is actually killing anything that was reliant on critical strike and vulnerable damage. We then have a second nerf to crowd-controlled enemies. The damage is decreased by 30%. There was a buff To the frozen enemies for the Sorcerer, it was increased by 20%. But you remember how your corpse tendrils now have less damage and less time for that damage. That means that your corpse tendrils got a double nerf because the damage that enemies are taking from crowd control was nerfed and the aspect of grasping veins was nerfed. So this is really a double dip into the Necromancer build. Now, I'm not going to go over these line by line, but as you can see towards the end, they tried to give some damage back. So you can see like physical damage was increased by 25%, bone skill damage increased by 25%, the blood skill damage increased by 25%. So they knew that they were working pretty heavy-handed in the first section of their nerfs, and they tried to give some damage back through this. But I don't feel like the amount of damage that they gave back is enough to make up for the damage that they've taken away. The bucket, having it being the first bucket that everything is multiplied by, is really nice, but I feel like the amount of damage that they took away from the other sections is very, very heavy-handed and really is going to put things in a perspective where you're just not getting the kind of numbers that you were getting before, and you may never see those either. At the end of this, they actually reduce your survivability, so total armor reduction by 30%. You're looking at all of the damage reductions: close enemies, distant enemies, enemies that are bleeding, enemies that are burning, enemies that are poisoned, enemies that have shadow damage over time, damage reduction while you're fortified. All of those received a 25% reduction, which means you will not have the same survivability that you had before, and you're also not going to have the same damage that you had before, which is why I feel like Season 1 is just one big nerf, and I'm seriously considering uninstalling Diablo 4. I want to know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. I'd like to thank all my YouTube members for your continued support. Y'all are absolute legends. If you'd like to become a legend, there's a button that says join on this page. Click that for details. There's 2 videos on the screen. Click one of those to watch next, and I'll meet you over there.